November 8, 1942. The sun had barely risen over the dusty, sun-scorched plains of North Africa, but already the desert seemed alive with the hum of engines, the distant sound of soldiers' footsteps, and the unmistakable tension of war. The German forces had spent months entrenched in this unforgiving land, their backs pressed against a desolate expanse where the enemy always seemed to be one step behind, until now. General Erwin Rommel stood at the edge of his command post, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faint glimmer of Allied forces appeared, moving like a swarm of ants across the sands. His reputation as the Desert Fox had been built on his ability to outmaneuver, outthink, and outfight. But even Rommel, one of the most respected strategists in the world, felt the weight of uncertainty in his chest. For the first time in the war, he had a sinking feeling that the tables were turning, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. Rommel had been tasked with securing the Axis's hold on North Africa, a region seen as crucial for maintaining control over the Mediterranean. His forces had faced the British in battle after battle, yet each victory had come at a steep cost. Now, with the launch of Operation Torch, a full-scale Allied invasion of French-controlled Morocco and Algeria, the game had changed. The landings had come as a surprise, catching the Axis forces off guard and forcing Rommel to shift his resources across multiple fronts. What he hadn't expected was the speed with which the Americans had mobilized. As Rommel stood in his tent, his fingers tracing the battle plans laid out in front of him, his mind raced. He had received a report that morning from a lieutenant who had been scouting the coastal areas. The American forces were advancing faster than expected. Their landings were not a small operation. They were a full-scale assault, one that threatened to unravel everything the Germans had built in the region. Rommel's mind snapped back to the present. He knew the importance of maintaining control in North Africa, not just for its strategic value, but for the morale of the Axis powers. He could not afford to lose here. Not now, when the stakes had never been higher. The Germans had already overstretched themselves in Russia, and their enemies in the east were growing stronger by the day. North Africa was supposed to be their foothold, but now it was slipping away. The tense silence of the war room was broken by the sharp click of boots against the stone floor. Colonel Heinrich Müller, Rommel's chief of staff, entered, his face pale, sweat lining his brow. He held a telegram in his hand, crumpled slightly from the pressure of the message it contained. "General," Müller said, his voice tight, "the Allied landings at Casablanca, they're fully underway. The Americans have landed in force. They're already engaging our forward positions." Rommel glanced up at Müller, his face betraying none of the worry he felt. He had seen many battles, and this was just another challenge to overcome, wasn't it? "What is their strength?" Rommel asked, his voice calm, but with an underlying urgency. "Their forces are well coordinated. They have significant air support. We've already lost contact with several forward units. General, the Americans, they're not what we expected," Müller replied, his eyes flickering toward the maps of the desert terrain that had once been his playground, now turning into his graveyard. Rommel didn't respond immediately. He turned back to the map, eyes scanning the details. Casablanca, Oran, Algiers, key points on the map that were now being threatened. His fingers traced the lines of supply routes, the ones he knew would soon be cut off if the Allies continued to press forward. The weight of command was suffocating. He could feel the burden of every decision he made now, each one potentially sealing the fate of his men. But it wasn't just about the tactical decisions. Rommel knew that the Allied forces, particularly the Americans, were not simply fighting for territory. They were fighting to break the backbone of Nazi control, to unleash the fury of their industrial war machine. The German leadership had underestimated America, believing them unprepared, but Rommel knew better now. The Americans had arrived with overwhelming force, and they weren't going to back down. As he turned back to face his officers, the gravity of the situation settled on him like a weight he couldn't shake. "We need to regroup," he said, his voice low but firm. "Prepare for a counteroffensive. We cannot afford to lose the initiative." But even as he gave the orders, a part of him wondered, had they already lost? Had the tide already turned, and he was simply too late to stop it? Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in Washington, D.C., the strategy that would change the course of the war was being enacted. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat in a room full of advisors, his face lit by the glow of the war map. The United States had entered the war only the year before, but already the sheer scale of their industrial power had begun to show. Factories churned out planes, tanks, and weapons at a speed the Germans had never imagined. The American military was a juggernaut, and they were now on the move. The key moment, however, was not just the invasion of North Africa. It was the realization that the United States could bring this industrial power to bear in ways that would outlast the Germans' ability to sustain their war effort. The Germans had focused too much on their strategic brilliance and too little on the American resolve. The German high command had assumed that the United States would be distracted by the war in the Pacific, that they would not be able to sustain a full-scale war in Europe. They were wrong. Roosevelt, speaking to his military chiefs, made it clear that this would be a war of attrition, one that the Germans could not win. "We will fight not only with our soldiers, but with every resource we have. We will stretch them thin, and they will break," Roosevelt said, his voice full of conviction. Back in North Africa, Rommel's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of gunfire in the distance. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and the ground trembled slightly under the weight of distant explosions. His soldiers were already engaged, fighting to hold positions that were slipping away with each passing hour. He could see the shadow of defeat creeping over them all. He stepped out of his command tent and looked into the horizon. The advancing Allied forces were getting closer. This was no longer a battle of small skirmishes. It was a full-scale conflict. Rommel knew he couldn't win this alone, and yet retreating was not an option. The world was watching, and his pride, his reputation, his entire identity as a leader was at stake. Müller approached him again, his face even more tense. "General, they're closing in on our southern flank. The Americans have cut through our defenses faster than we anticipated." Rommel's gaze hardened, his mind working rapidly. His fingers tightened on the map as he considered his options. He could order a retreat, but that would be a surrender, a sign of weakness. No, he couldn't allow it. He had to push back. But how? The moment of indecision was broken by the sound of more artillery fire. Much closer now. Rommel felt a surge of urgency. This was it. The battle was at hand. "Prepare to counterattack," Rommel commanded. "We fight to the end." But even as he gave the order, a knot formed in his stomach. He knew that this was a battle they couldn't win, not with the strength the Americans had brought to bear. The realization gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake it. As the sound of the artillery grew louder, a terrible thought struck him. What if it was already too late? The battle was about to begin, but Rommel knew deep down that this was not just a fight for territory. This was a fight for survival, and the consequences of failure would reverberate through the entire Nazi war machine. The storm had already begun, and there was no turning back. The desert, once a harsh but familiar battleground, now felt like a prison. The golden sands stretched endlessly under the relentless sun, and every gust of wind carried with it the scent of dust and the weight of impending defeat. Rommel, usually so calm and decisive, found himself in a constant state of unease. His forces had been stretched too thin, supplies were dwindling, and now with the Allied invasion pressing in from both the east and the west, it seemed the war was slipping beyond his control. The quiet hum of military engines was broken by the sound of a radio crackling. Rommel's chief of staff, Colonel Heinrich Müller, stood at attention as the communication officer passed him a message. The colonel's face tightened, his eyes scanning the words before he looked up at Rommel. The urgency in his expression told the general all he needed to know. "General," Müller began, "the Americans are moving faster than we anticipated. Our southern flank is on the verge of collapse." Rommel turned to face the map that had been pinned to the wall, his fingers tracing the lines of supply routes and key defensive positions. The American forces had made significant progress since Operation Torch had begun. The Allies had proven to be far more prepared than he had anticipated, their tactics swift, their coordination flawless. And now, with Rommel's forces on the back foot, he could feel the pressure building from every side. The German general had always prided himself on his ability to think quickly, to turn a losing situation into a tactical advantage. But this time, it felt different. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the enemy was relentless. He could not afford to lose North Africa. Not now, not when so much was riding on this campaign. "Prepare for a counter-offensive," Rommel said, his voice calm But there was an edge to it that wasn't there before. "We will push them back." As the officers began to leave the tent to organize the attack, Müller remained standing, watching Rommel's every move. The tension was palpable. The men under Rommel's command had always respected him, even revered him. But Müller could see the toll the constant fighting was taking on the general. Rommel's usual composure was starting to crack, his eyes betraying the fear that he had not allowed himself to acknowledge, the fear of failure. Meanwhile, not far from Rommel's command post, Captain Hans Müller, no relation to the colonel, sat in a dimly lit tent, his head in his hands. He had been a soldier for most of his life, his family's legacy tied to the military. He had fought in France, in the Balkans, and now here, in the heart of the African desert. But no battle had shaken him quite like this one. The men under his command, tired and broken from weeks of nonstop fighting, were starting to question everything. The constant bombardment from the Allies, the exhaustion of never-ending battles, and the sudden realization that victory might be an impossibility had begun to erode their morale. And it wasn't just the fighting that wore on him, it was the sense of futility. Hans had grown up believing in the strength of his country, in the righteousness of the cause. But now as the sounds of artillery echoed in the distance, he couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that had taken root in his heart. Was this really the fight worth dying for? The Germans had promised a swift victory, but all he saw now were retreating soldiers, falling into a battle they could not win. He glanced over at Private Klaus Richter, who was seated nearby, cleaning his rifle. Klaus had been with him since the beginning of the campaign, and over the weeks Hans had come to see him, not just as a subordinate, but as a younger brother. But lately Klaus had begun to show signs of cracking under the pressure. The once bright-eyed soldier was now sullen, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Klaus," Hans called softly, his voice carrying a hint of concern. "How are you holding up?" Klaus looked up, his face pale, his eyes clouded. "I'm not sure anymore, sir. I've lost count of how many men we've lost in these sands. How many more must we lose before this madness ends?" Hans couldn't answer. He had no words to offer. The war, which had once felt so far away from his peaceful life in Bavaria, had now consumed everything. It wasn't just about soldiers fighting in trenches anymore. It was about their very survival, their humanity. And with every passing day, Hans found it harder and harder to reconcile what he was doing with what he believed in. As Klaus turned away, Hans stared at the horizon, where the last vestiges of daylight were fading. His mind wandered to the prospect of what would come next. The Americans were coming, and they were relentless. Rommel had ordered a counteroffensive, but Hans couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. Would they be able to push back the Allies, or was this the beginning of the end for their campaign? Back at Rommel's command post, the final preparations for the counteroffensive were underway. The men under Rommel's command, though weary and battle-worn, rallied to his side. But even as they readied themselves to fight once more, there was an unease in the air. The Germans had already lost significant ground. Their defenses were weakening, and the Americans were only getting stronger. Rommel, however, knew there was no turning back. He could not afford a retreat, not without risking everything he had fought for. But deep inside, he knew the truth. They were fighting a losing battle. The Americans had already brought to bear an industrial strength that the Germans could not match. Their tanks, their aircraft, their munitions, all outpaced the Germans' efforts. Yet Rommel still believed that he could turn the tide. He had always believed in himself, in his ability to adapt to any situation. But the realization was setting in that this wasn't just another battle. This was a war of attrition, and Germany was on the losing side. As the command to move out was given, Rommel stood for a moment, watching his men prepare. The sound of boots marching, rifles clinking, and engines roaring to life filled the air. The counteroffensive had begun, but in his heart, Rommel knew. This battle would decide more than just North Africa. It would decide the course of the entire war. In the distance, the first rumblings of artillery fire could be heard. Rommel's forces moved forward, but the weight of their burden was heavy. Their victory, once a near certainty, was now a distant dream. The Americans were coming, and they were not going to stop. As the battle unfolded, the Germans were about to face a reckoning they had never expected. But it wasn't just about tactics anymore. This battle would be a test of endurance, of will, and as the first shots were fired, it was clear that this was no longer just a fight for land. It was a fight for their very survival. And somewhere deep inside the desert sands, Hans Müller knew that this war was far from over, but its consequences were already set in motion. The morning of November 23, 1942, dawned grim and heavy, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The air was thick with dust, the sunlight cutting through the haze like a blade. Hans Müller's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the cold metal of his rifle, eyes fixed on the shifting lines of battle that spread out before him. The German forces had been in retreat for days, pushed back from one defensive position to the next by the relentless American advance, and now the final stand was upon them. Rommel had ordered a counteroffensive, an all-or-nothing push to regain lost ground and turn the tide in North Africa. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The future of the German military in the region depended on this attack, and there was no room for failure. Rommel, though weary and desperate, remained as resolute as ever. He believed that with a successful strike, the Allies could be repelled, their invasion thwarted. But as Hans stood in the midst of the preparation, his mind weighed heavily on him. The men around him were exhausted, their faces drawn and hollow. Many had fought in this unforgiving desert for months. Supplies were low, morale even lower. It had become more than a battle for territory. It was a fight for survival. And the question that hung over every soldier's head: could they win this? The air smelled of burnt fuel, the distant rumble of tanks and artillery filling the silence between each command. Hans, usually resolute and unwavering, now found himself questioning everything he had fought for. He had followed Rommel through thick and thin, but something about this battle felt different. He couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that it was too late. The Americans had already proven that they would not back down. They were relentless, and with every passing day, their power only grew stronger. As the sun rose higher, the first wave of German forces began their assault. Hans, stationed with his unit on the southern flank, prepared to advance. His orders were clear: hold the line at all costs. But as the sound of explosions grew closer, the weight of his moral dilemma became impossible to ignore. To his right, Klaus Richter, the young soldier he had come to see as a brother, looked at him with wide eyes, his face pale. "Sir, what if we're walking into a trap? What if this is a mistake?" Hans opened his mouth to reassure him, but the words felt hollow. He had no answer. The truth was, he didn't know. He had been fighting this war for so long, blindly following orders, convinced that the cause was just. But now, as he stood on the precipice of battle, he realized that something had changed inside him. The war had always been about victory, about honor. But now, with his men's lives on the line and the weight of defeat looming, it was about something far more personal. "I don't know, Klaus," Hans said, his voice quiet, "but we do what we're ordered to do." Klaus nodded, but the unease in his eyes didn't fade. The battle was about to begin, and the uncertainty of the situation hung in the air like a thick fog. Hans could sense that something was going to happen, something that would change everything. The battle began with a deafening roar. The ground shook beneath Hans's feet as the first artillery shells landed, tearing up the earth and sending plumes of dust into the air. The German forces advanced with a brutal intensity, their tanks charging forward, followed by infantry in tight formation. Hans, with Klaus by his side, led his men through the chaos, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. The battlefield was a blur: explosions, screams, the clash of metal and the cries of soldiers. The advance was swift, but as they moved closer to the enemy lines, Hans felt a growing sense of dread. The Americans were no longer the disorganized, ill-prepared soldiers they had once been. They had adapted quickly, and now they fought with precision, their firepower overwhelming. Hans's unit, struggling to keep up with the pace of the offensive, found itself pinned down by a hail of gunfire from entrenched American positions. The air was thick with tracer rounds and the once familiar sounds of battle. Machine guns, tanks, explosions were now accompanied by an undercurrent of fear. Hans's thoughts raced as he ducked behind a piece of debris, the noise deafening around him. How had it come to this? The Germans had underestimated the Americans. But more than that, they had underestimated the spirit of the men on the other side. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. This wasn't just a battle of tactics anymore. It was a battle of will. And in that moment, he wasn't sure which side had the stronger resolve. "Klaus!" Hans shouted, looking through the haze of smoke for his comrade. He could barely hear himself over the cacophony of battle. "Klaus, where are you?" He spotted Klaus's figure crouched behind a tank, firing back at the Americans. But then, the world seemed to slow down. As Hans watched, Klaus was struck, his body crumpling as the force of the bullet knocked him to the ground. Hans felt a wave of panic rise in his chest, and without thinking, he bolted toward him, desperate to reach his friend. "Klaus!" Hans screamed, ignoring the gunfire around him. But it was too late. Klaus lay motionless, a pool of blood forming around him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Hans knelt beside Klaus, his hands shaking as he tried to feel for a pulse. But there was nothing. The young soldier, his friend, his brother, was gone. The realization hit him like a wave. The war had taken everything from him. It had taken Klaus, and now it threatened to take him too. Hans stood up, his heart heavy with grief, his mind consumed by rage and helplessness. He could feel his resolve crumbling. The cause that had once seemed so clear was now obscured by the bloodshed and death that surrounded him. As the battle raged on, Hans faced a choice. Rommel's orders had been clear: retake the ground, push forward at all costs. But as he looked around him, at the bodies of his comrades, at the broken soldiers who would never see their homes again, Hans realized that he could no longer blindly follow the orders. This was no longer about victory, it was about survival. He looked toward the lines of German soldiers advancing with determination, their faces filled with the same conviction that had carried them into countless battles. But in his heart, Hans knew that they were fighting a war they couldn't win. He had to make a choice: obey Rommel's orders and continue the offensive, or do something that could change everything. A part of him wanted to stay and fight, to honor the memory of Klaus and the other soldiers who had given everything. But another part of him, one that he couldn't ignore any longer, knew that the war was lost. He turned toward his commanding officers, a decision weighing heavily on his conscience. The fight was slipping away, and as Hans stood there, the sounds of battle raging around him, he realized that the time had come to make a choice, one that would change everything. The tension was at its peak. Hans was about to make a decision that would not only determine the fate of his unit, but also his own future. As the war raged on around him, the stakes could not have been higher. The path ahead was uncertain. The line between duty and survival had never been thinner. The world seemed to shudder around Hans as he stood amidst the chaos of battle, torn between the duty that had bound him to his comrades and the rising tide of guilt that threatened to drown him. The desert, once a place of strategic advantage, had become a wasteland, a barren stretch of land littered with the broken bodies of men who had believed in victory, only to be swept away by the unforgiving tide of war. The radio crackled in his ear, bringing him back to the harsh reality of the present. "Captain Müller, we've lost communication with the main offensive." The voice on the other end was tight, almost frantic. "The Americans have broken through the southern flank. We need to regroup, or we'll be surrounded." Hans's heart pounded in his chest. Surrounded. It wasn't just the battlefield that had changed. It was him. The soldier who had once followed orders without question, who had stood tall in the face of danger, now felt like a shell of himself. He glanced down at Klaus's body, lying lifeless in the dust, and a sharp, painful ache pierced his chest. His friend, his brother in arms, was gone, and all Hans could feel was emptiness. What was the point of it all? The ground trembled under the force of an explosion nearby, shaking him from his thoughts. He could hear the distant rattle of gunfire, the screams of men caught in the crossfire, and yet amidst the cacophony of battle, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about the war. This was about doing what he knew in his heart was right. Escape. They had to escape. Hans's thoughts raced as he glanced at his unit. His men, weary and battered, were holding their positions, but the resolve that had once burned bright in their eyes had begun to flicker. They were tired. They were losing. And as much as he hated to admit it, Hans knew that if they didn't abandon their position soon, they would all be trapped in a war they could no longer win. He turned to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Frank Weber, a man who had followed him through countless campaigns. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, but there was a fire in his eyes that Hans knew had seen far too much. "Weber," Hans said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts raging inside him. "The battle is lost. We need to retreat. Now." Weber's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the sounds of the American advance were growing louder. He hesitated, his lips parting as if to argue. But then he simply nodded. There was no time for debate. The moment of decision had arrived. The men had to survive. There was no honor left in this fight, just the desperate hope that they might make it out alive. But then a voice pierced the air, a cry of terror that cut through the noise of the battle like a blade. Hans whipped around, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. Through the smoke and dust, he saw a group of his men, cornered by American soldiers. They were surrounded, their backs pressed against the crumbling ruins of a nearby building. Hans's breath caught in his throat. His heart raced. There was no time to waste. He turned back to Weber. "We have to save them. I'll cover the retreat. You get the men out of here." Weber looked at him, his eyes wide with understanding, but his voice cracked with hesitation. "Sir, we'll be trapped if you stay." "I know," Hans said quietly, "but I'll make sure you get out. That's an order, Lieutenant." The American soldiers were closing in fast, their guns raised, their faces set in grim determination. Hans's mind raced as he assessed the situation. He had been through many battles, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting to win anymore. He was fighting to save lives. With a deep breath, Hans ran toward the trapped soldiers, his rifle raised. His heart thundered in his chest as he fired, sending the first American soldier to the ground. The others responded quickly, but the chaos of battle had already taken its toll. Hans knew they didn't have much time. "Cover them!" Hans shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get to the trucks, now!" The remaining soldiers, who had been huddled in fear, snapped to attention, moving quickly as Hans and Weber laid down cover fire. Hans felt his heart in his throat as he watched the men scramble for safety. He fired again, his vision blurring as he adjusted his aim. The Americans were relentless, but so were the Germans. Hans's determination grew as he realized there was only one chance left to get his men out alive. But just as the last of the soldiers reached safety, a bullet struck Hans in the shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall, his hand instinctively reaching for the wound. Blood soaked his uniform, but the pain was secondary. There was no time for it. He had to keep fighting. The battle around him was becoming a blur. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the sound of gunfire deafening. But in that moment, Hans knew he had no choice. He had given everything, his body, his soul, his belief in the cause. And now he was ready to pay the ultimate price. He reached for the grenade at his belt, pulling the pin with a practiced hand. The blast would clear the path for his retreating men. It was the only way. "Go!" Hans shouted to Weber, who was still trying to assist him, his face full of concern. "Get them out of here! Go now!" Weber hesitated for only a moment before he nodded, his expression hardening as he helped the last few soldiers into the trucks. Hans turned toward the advancing Americans, his heart racing. This would be the last stand. With a final, defiant roar, Hans hurled the grenade toward the enemy positions, the explosion ringing through the air as the ground shook beneath his feet. In that instant, everything slowed. Hans could feel the weight of the decision. The grenade would buy them a few precious moments, enough for the retreating men to escape. But as the dust settled and the world came back into focus, Hans collapsed, his vision dimming. The pain in his shoulder was unbearable, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But as he lay there staring at the sky, a strange sense of peace washed over him. In the distance, the trucks carrying his men disappeared into the desert, leaving behind the battlefield and the nightmare that had unfolded there. Hans had done his part. He had saved them. As the darkness took over, he thought of Klaus, of his comrades, of the war. He thought of his decisions, the ones that had led him to this moment. And as his eyes fluttered shut, the weight of it all fell away. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The men he had saved would live to fight another day. The battle raged on, but the consequences of Hans's selfless act were clear. The war would continue, but for him it was over. The German forces were retreating, their lines broken, their future uncertain. But Hans Müller had made a choice that had cost him everything. And as the dust settled in the desert, The course of the war had been irrevocably altered. The Allies would push forward, the Nazis would retreat, and somewhere in the silent sands of North Africa, a soldier lay, having given everything for a cause that had long since slipped beyond their grasp. The desert once again lay in silence. The battle had moved on, the echoes of gunfire fading into the distance as the American forces pushed forward. But in the wake of that chaos, the true cost of the conflict was becoming apparent. Hans Müller's body lay motionless in the sand, the blood from his wounds staining the earth beneath him. The dust that had once felt like a shield against the harsh realities of war now felt like a blanket, suffocating him, holding him in place even as the battle raged around him. The trucks carrying his comrades had made their escape, retreating into the unknown vastness of the desert. But Hans, the man who had sacrificed everything to protect them, was left behind, alone in the aftermath of his decision. His body, battered and broken, had fought a losing battle, but his heart in those final moments had found peace. The sound of distant gunfire now seemed a world away. Hans's thoughts were no longer consumed by the immediate chaos of the war. Instead, he found himself reflecting on the choices that had led him to this place. His mind wandered back to the first days of the conflict, when the Nazis had promised victory, when he had believed in the righteousness of their cause. He had followed orders without question, believing that his sacrifices would lead to triumph. But now as he lay there, waiting for the inevitable, those early ideals seemed so distant, so hollow. The war, once a matter of patriotism and duty, had become a brutal struggle for survival. The faces of his fallen comrades flashed before him. Men like Klaus, whose youthful enthusiasm had been crushed by the weight of war. And with each memory, the question that had plagued him for weeks returned, louder than ever. Was it worth it? His decision to sacrifice himself for his men had been born out of duty. But as the moments stretched on, Hans realized that his true motivation had been something deeper. A desire to protect those who could still live, to give them a chance at a future. It wasn't about the war anymore. It was about humanity, about the bonds forged in battle, and the strength that came from making the right choice, even at the cost of one's own life. Back in the German command post, word of the retreat spread quickly. The failure of the counteroffensive was evident. The Allies had broken through, and the dream of victory in North Africa had crumbled. The consequences were clear. Rommel's forces had been decisively defeated. Yet within the chaos of their defeat, there was a strange sense of resolve among the German soldiers who had survived. Colonel Heinrich Müller, Rommel's right-hand man, received the news of Hans's sacrifice with a heavy heart. He had known the captain well. They had shared many quiet moments during the early days of the campaign, when victory seemed certain. But now, as he stood in the aftermath of the failed offensive, Müller couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing sense of loss. The men had retreated to regroup, but there was no longer any certainty about the future. The American forces had proven themselves to be formidable adversaries, unpredictable, relentless, and united. The Germans, once confident in their superiority, now found themselves on the defensive, fighting to hold on to the territory they had once taken for granted. Yet amidst the devastation, there were whispers of Hans Müller's final act of heroism. The men who had survived, the men who had been saved by his sacrifice, spoke of him in hushed tones, a sense of reverence in their voices. He had given everything, not for victory, but for them, for their survival. In a world that was quickly slipping into chaos, Hans had become something more than just a soldier. He had become a symbol of the moral complexities that underpinned every decision in war. His choice to abandon the offensive, to retreat in the face of certain defeat, was not just an act of military strategy, it was an act of selflessness, of humanity. As the days passed, the war continued its brutal march forward. The Allies pressed on, their victory in North Africa a significant step in the larger struggle. But for Hans Müller, the war had ended. The world he had once believed in, where loyalty, duty, and honor defined the course of action, had been shattered by the brutal realities of conflict. And now in his final moments, he realized that the true victory lay not in the battles won or lost, but in the choices we make when faced with the greatest of hardships. Hans had fought for something greater than victory. He had fought for the future of those he cared about, even if it meant sacrificing his own. In the end, his death was not in vain. His comrades lived to fight another day, carrying his memory with them, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is light to be found in selflessness. The true cost of war is not measured in territory gained or lost, but in the lives that are changed forever. In Hans Müller's final act of courage, he transcended the battlefield. He understood that the heart of a soldier isn't just in his ability to fight, but in his ability to choose mercy and sacrifice when it's needed most. War forces us to make impossible decisions, but it's those decisions that reveal our true character. Hans's choice to sacrifice himself for his men became a beacon of hope in the midst of despair, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity can still prevail. Inspired by a true letter from 1943, found in the personal effects of a German officer who fought in North Africa, the officer's final words, written before his death in battle, mirrored the moral struggle faced by many soldiers during the conflict. His letter urged his comrades to remember that true strength lies not in victory, but in the choices made when faced with the greatest of challenges.